bring investigative reporter for the New York Times, Suzanne Craig. She was inside the courthouse yesterday. Also with us, former assistant district attorney in Manhattan, NBC News legal analyst Catherine Christian. Good morning to you both. Suzanne, I'll start with you since you were down there yesterday. Let's start with the gag order first. Donald Trump saying all I did was repost other people violating the gag order effectively. That seems like a pretty thin defense against these charges from the DA's office that he's violated the gag order 10 times. We heard Judge Merchan becoming frustrated in the courtroom. Do you suspect that we're going to hear that, yes, he did in fact violate the gag order? And if so, is it a fine? What comes after that?
No, it seems likely that that's where it's heading. The judge was just very frustrated at points, growing angry with him over, and it was over, Todd Blanche, his lawyer's presentation. At one point, the judge is asking for precedent. Bring me some legal argument forward for what you're saying. And Todd Blanche is saying, well, there is no precedent. It's just common sense. And I think what Donald Trump was learning for his whole life, words have had very little value to him. But in court, there's consequences for this. And I think we can see anything from a fine, potentially, to, I'm not sure it's going to go to incarceration. That's an option. But I think there's some other things open to the judge. For example, there could be somebody put in place to vet his tweets, somebody maybe on his legal team or somebody else. So I think there could be other things that the judge is going to consider. But I think one thing that I felt certain about when I was sitting in the courtroom is something is going to happen to clamp down on this.
Catherine, you've been around for quite a while in courts. You ever seen anything like this? Ever heard of anything like this?
No. I've seen defendants misbehave because, that happens. And it's interesting because Judge Merchan is the presiding judge of the mental health court in Manhattan. He's been doing that for years. And he's probably seen it. So I don't want to make light of that. But quite frankly, that's the only time I've seen it, when you've had a sort of an unwell person. Donald Trump, obviously, in the courtroom is now behaving himself, but coming out of the courtroom and continuing to violate this gag order, I haven't seen repeated violations. And when you do see it, they get more than the fine, defendants. In the real world, when you violate orders in a criminal world, there's a consequence, and it's usually incarceration if it's repeated.
You want to take a guess at how much money Donald Trump would raise if he were ever incarcerated, even for a night?
And I don't think that will happen. But what will the judge do after he finds him? And then this weekend, assuming that's what he does, Donald Trump does it again. What is the judge going to do?
So what are we not seeing that you're seeing being in the court as far as the man? We hear he's slumped over, we hear he's cold, where he walks in, he looks at the jurors. Just kind of give us the fabric of the man in the courtroom.
Yeah, he's cold, he's hot, there's a lot going on there. And I've got a view of him because I'm in an overflow room and we've got a monitor where I can see him. You're seeing, if I had to describe, there's been occasions where he has, I think, nodded off, and we're very careful when we report that. Mm-hmm. There's been a couple times where he's had his eyes closed. Is he sleeping? I'm not Donald Trump. I don't know. But occasionally his head will go down while his eyes are closed, and then it will snap back up. I saw there was one incident on, I think it was Tuesday, where his lawyer passed him a note and had to he had his eyes closed, and I was watching it, and he had to nudge him awake, and he jolted awake. But for the most part, he's got a scowl on his face. I think that would be, if I had to say, 90% of the time. And he's sometimes looking just dead ahead. Sometimes he's watching the proceedings. He seemed engaged with watching Pecker. There wasn't a lot of motion. The one time that we've seen him animated and sort of, I would say, smiling or laughing, were during jury selections. There were a few jurors who had read Art of the Deal. He seemed pleased with that. There was one juror who said her hobby was watching TV on her couch. She seemed to like that. But that's really the only time we've seen him kind of light up.
Yeah, never underestimate an author's ability to be flattered when somebody says that they've read one of their books. Catherine, look, obviously we have weeks to go, but we're now a couple of days into testimony, and I just wondered if you could give us a kind of scorecard on how you think the prosecution is doing up until now. How's it going?
Well, so far, and I always caution people, direct examination, wait for the cross, because you can have a witness who does very well and the prosecutor sits down and says, phew, and then you have an excellent defense attorney who comes up and can not just destroy a witness, but also make points for their case. So Mr. Pecker has been very good for the prosecution. He's been very credible in that he is his authentic self. I'm a checkbook journalism guy. This is what I do. But what he also does, which the defense will probably cross him on, is he spent his career as a publisher lying, having stories in National Enquirer that aren't true. So they could make use of that. But in terms of establishing the conspiracy, that Trump Tower meeting right after Donald Trump announced his candidacy, it's very important that David Pecker establish that he was the one who's going to be the eyes and ears, and Michael Cohen was the go-to person who was going to learn about these negative stories and give Donald Trump the heads up. So David Pecker is very important to establish that this conspiracy allegedly exists.
So, Suzanne, I want to get to Donnie and Simone about the dynamic of no crowd out there for him, like clapping for him and applauding and, waving signs. We'll get to that in a moment. But I first, in terms of his behavior in and out of the courtroom and the gag order, I'm wondering if it strikes you at all, just from covering this, that he hasn't mentioned Pecker in his Truth Social posts or any of his rants. It just seems like he's dancing around that one. Maybe that's just me, but he goes after Michael Cohen. He goes after other witnesses, but not Pecker. Thoughts?
Right, you're absolutely right. And Michael Cohen, one of the reasons could be is Michael Cohen has been very vocal in going after him, and they have a sort of a sparring match. David Pecker has not entered this at all in terms of any sort of social media posts that Donald Trump has done. You're left to wonder, and we just don't know, is there a reason behind the scenes? Is there something about the relationship between the two men, something they know about each other that's causing him to hold back? We just don't know, but so far it hasn't happened, and it didn't happen overnight. It is, and I just also want to say David Pecker is going to be very interesting on cross-examination because we don't know, first of all, what will come up about him, what Donald Trump may know that could come up. And it's also, to Catherine's point, it was an excellent point. David Pecker has been, I've found him very credible on the stand in terms of his presentation. But you have to remember, it seems now at this point, Donald Trump and David Pecker are the godfathers of fake news. And that's going to hurt David Pecker when cross-examination comes. I mean, he's saying that they made up stories. And it's really going to, I think they're going to use that to undermine his credibility. But you're absolutely right. So far, there's just been nothing on social media from Donald Trump to David Pecker. He's just, he's holding back on that.
Yeah, he doesn't touch it. No. All right, so Donnie and Simone. First, Donnie, knowing him, but both of you, about sort of the showman that Donald Trump is. He loves to have his rallies. He gets the crowd going. They're screaming. They're applauding for him saying the most disgusting things about January 6 hostages and Acquire, and crowds going wild. They love it. He loves it, and he's got this energy. And he walks outside the courtroom, and every day he's got this opportunity before walking in and after walking out to talk to the cameras. But I think it's a very different scene. It's dour, it's dark, it's gloomy, it's gross. He's got the worst fluorescent lighting going right through his hair. And I just wonder if he feels just not like he can really do his thing from this position. And also the people taking pictures and asking questions. It's the New York media, maybe some people on the street if they're there. It just doesn't seem like he's got his game on, even though it's an opportunity to do something.
I think
Donnie?
The net, when you watch what's going on with him and you watch what's going on with this trial, is a yuck. This whole thing is a yuck.
So
and
gross.
It's just gross. The whole thing is sleazy, it's tawdry, it's ugly. Look, the story we did before this was about abortion and women's health rights. And then you see this circus act, this sleaze act, this greasy, slimy story, and I think it's tired. This feels like a moment in time. You look at it, and there's abortion, and there's democracy issues, and there's two wars going on, and there's a crisis at the border, and I just think the average American looks at this and says, I've had enough. I've had enough. This has been a show, and whether you like it or hate it, you've leaned in. We've leaned in since he came down that elevator in 2015. It feels like it's time that people are leaning out. They've just had enough.
It's the exhaustion factor.
It's exhausting. Stop it. I can't look at you. And by the way, the lack of crowds speak to that. There are no crowds outside. No. It's 8 people, it's 10 people, it's 12 people, it's somebody with their iPhone holding it up.
And they're not Trump supporter. There's a few, but a lot of them are just QAnon and conspiracy theory people. There's not a lot of flags.
No,
for him.
it just feels like it's over. And by the way, this was the trial that was not going to matter. This was not the Electoral College. This was not the election stealing trial. This was not the insurrection trial. This was not the documents trial. This was the trial that didn't. What it matters, it shows that he just doesn't seem to matter as much anymore.
Well, I don't know. Simone, it just feels like sometimes the emperor has no clothes, and in this, it just feels like one of those moments where, like, we're hearing about his private life. Nobody wants to know about it, by the way. Nobody wants to imagine that. Nobody wants that mental image, okay? And on top of it, you got this guy named Pecker. You keep hearing Pecker, Pecker, Pecker. It's ridiculous.
It's so ironic, Mika. It's like if you wrote this in a script and tried to sell it, they would be like, please, the ridiculousness and the over the top is too much for me. Mika, I think you're right. And I take Donnie's point, right? He looks small, and it's very diminishing. Like, Donald Trump was the 45th president of the United States of America. Okay, the presidency is the pinnacle of everything, and not just here in America, across the world. And sitting in a courtroom, standing outside of that courtroom with the bad fluorescent lighting, sitting there, he looks small. This does not look like a world leader. And I think the pictures and these images, they are making this across, they are making this into the, as I like to say, the non-political group chats. I think the details here, though, which is why the reporting and people like Suzanne, who have been in and out of the courtroom throughout this trial, are so important, and Catherine, who can really break down for us what all these things mean. The detriment to the American people is that they cannot see this for themselves, right? And I think the best thing that happened for the American people while Donald Trump was president, when COVID happened, was the COVID briefings, because they could see the crazy for themselves. And they are not able to see the crazy for themselves. They have to read about it and live vicariously through Mika and I's reenactments of the Pecker on the stand. And I think that is, I don't think it doesn't matter. I just think that people, it's not front and center for them in a way in which that is completely accessible to them. And so some of the details are missed, which is why what we do here is so important.
Yeah. Investigative reporter for the New York Times, Suzanne Craig.